This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, that's AASA, which is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. It's also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series at Sydney University Press. I look forward to talking to you lots more about both ASA and the Animal Publics series in future podcasts, but right now I want to address the elephant in the room. As many of you will know, Siobhan O'Sullivan was recently diagnosed with ovarian cancer and is now undergoing treatment. This means that she will not be able to host Knowing Animals for some time while she focuses on getting better. I'm sure that all of the regular listeners of Knowing Animals wish Siobhan the best, and I hope that she has a great time being able to enjoy Knowing Animals as a listener rather than as the host. And Siobhan will hopefully be back very soon to host the podcast once again. In the meantime, I'm going to be looking after things. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a philosopher and animal studies scholar based in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield. It's a great honour to have been asked to take the reins for Siobhan, and I hope you'll all enjoy and learn from the episodes that I record over the next few weeks and months. But on with the show. Today we're joined virtually by Dr Kendra Coulter. Kendra is an Associate Professor and the Department Chair in the Department of Labour Studies at Brock University in Ontario, Canada. She's also a Fellow of the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics and a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists and Scientists. We're going to discuss her chapter Toward Humane Jobs and Work-Lives for Animals, which was published in Oxford University Press's 2020 volume Animal Labour: A New Frontier of Interspecies Justice. And this volume was edited by Kendra, along with two previous Knowing Animals guests, the legal scholar Charlotte E. Blattner and the political philosopher Will Kymlicka. Welcome to the podcast, Kendra.
Thank you very much, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here. And I, of course, would just like to start by wishing Siobhan the very best.
Now, before I ask you about the chapter, could I ask you how this book came about?
It's a good question. I think it came to life at Queen's University in Ontario, here in Canada. Charlotte Blattner, the legal scholar who you mentioned, was working with Will Kymlicka for her postdoc, and I think wanted to begin studying labor issues. And when they were discussing it, at some point, because I'd written a lot about animal labor, my name came up, and they invited me to be involved. And of course, the rest is history. And the results are a really compelling and thought-provoking volume, recently published by Oxford University Press.
Great, thanks. And do you want to introduce listeners to your contribution, your chapter in the volume?
Sure. We have a co-written introduction, and then the chapter that I authored on my own launches some of the discussion and focuses in particular on whether animals can have what I call humane jobs. And so this concept of humane jobs is one I developed a few years ago after thinking and delving deeply into questions about the intersections of animals and work, and realizing that not only was there a shortage of scholarship on animals and labor at that time, there's a little bit more now, although certainly more needed. Most of it was critique. And I think that's very true in a lot of the sort of animals and social justice scholarship, is that, we rightly and justifiably allocate a lot of time and energy to identifying and critiquing the ideas, practices, and patterns which are damaging to animals and often to people and the environment as well. But in addition to critique, I've long argued and known that we need alternatives. And I've proposed this sort of pithy concept of humane jobs as one that can be used by academics, researchers, policymakers, but also by frontline advocates and different kinds of worker activists. And so I was inspired by a lot of the work done on green jobs or good green jobs. Historically, we've been told that you can't protect the environment and have good jobs. Of course, we now know that that's incorrect. And the idea of good green jobs was proposed to try to reconcile that tension, to say we of course need a sustainable and healthy environment, but we simultaneously need good jobs. So how can we create good jobs that are about protecting the environment? So inspired by that kind of political activism and that sort of research and scholarship, I coined the term humane jobs, which succinctly, means work that is good for both people and animals. And so most of my research on humane jobs has been about how to create more humane jobs for people. So that can mean more in terms of the quality of the jobs, that there are certain jobs which are helping animals but are maybe lousier or more precarious for the human workers. It can also mean creating more humane jobs numerically, and that we just need more good jobs. And so why wouldn't we allocate time and energy and investment, thought leadership to developing and growing positive areas of work that are about helping animals rather than harming them? So there are things we want to replace. What are we going to do instead? So because so much of the harm caused to animals is because of profit seeking and different kinds of industries that employ people, a lot of my work has focused on how can we be doing things better or differently? How can we be growing the workforce in positive and helpful areas to replace the areas we want to eliminate? But at the same time, the question then becomes, well, can animals be working? And can animals have humane jobs? Can they themselves be holders of humane jobs? And I've speculated a bit on that over the last few years. I've talked a bit about what labor rights they would be owed, what sorts of protections and entitlements should be considered. And in this chapter, I really turned my attention to the question of, can animals have humane jobs? What might they look like? What might those criteria be? And that's its focus.
Excellent. So I take it that your answer is that yes, they can have humane jobs.
You're putting me on the spot here, Josh. I want to invite people to read the chapter, of course. The chapter is an exploration, and I'm very much a data-driven scholar in that I do believe research is important. And so I don't normally make sort of a totalizing or homogenizing claim. I think there's a need for a lot of nuance and greater understanding. So instead, I identify what I think are areas of potential for animals to have humane jobs. So, as a labor studies scholar, I fully recognize that work, paid work in particular, it's not paid in a conventional sense when we're thinking about animals and specifically, but I guess what I mean are formal jobs that can be assigned to others, can be, good, bad, ugly, or more complicated. And that work to me is not necessarily a problem or inherently damaging or oppressive. It certainly can be, and we need to recognize that. But that work is a broader spectrum, and so I certainly would argue that it's possible for animals to contribute, to use their intelligence, their emotional skills, their empathy, the unique attributes that they have to partner with us, to collaborate with us, to engage in reciprocal or ideally solidaristic forms of work that fundamentally respect them, and not only when they're on the job, but their life more broadly. And so in the chapter, I not only consider the prospects for humane jobs, but humane work lives. And with that concept, I'm building on decades of feminist and cross-cultural research that recognizes that what we do in our formal job does not exist in isolation, that we are whole beings. We have lives, feelings, experiences, desires, and relationships that are undoubtedly affected by our formal work, but also separate from them. We have had experiences prior to our careers. We don't spend 24 hours a day in our careers, so on a daily basis, we are quote unquote away from work. And of course, we think about our lives after our formal careers have ended. So I use this term work lives, which can be applied to people certainly, but I use it to think about animals' work lives. So that means considering them as whole beings on a day-to-day basis, so including when they're not engaged in their formal work, but also that we need to be recognizing their experiences over the full course of their lives. So what is happening to them early in life in terms of their experiences, their social relationships, perhaps training that they're undergoing to prepare for their job in some cases, and then what's going to happen to them after they work. I think that's absolutely crucial, that we think about things like retirement and dignity, what is owed to animals who are going to engage in work with and for us. So I do, cautiously believe it's possible for animals to engage in humane jobs and have humane work lives, provided that we are very attentive to them, provided that we don't impose a one-size-fits-all model, that we develop tools and mechanisms for continually assessing their well-being, perhaps that we have formal protections in place for them, whether those are at an organizational level or the scale of public policy or law. So these are all really crucial questions that I interrogate and offer what I hope will be some food for thought and fodder for future research.
Absolutely. That's great. So I hear the kind of caution in your approach here. And I'm thinking about the fact that you said that a lot of previous work on animal labor rights, or animal labor, I should say, has been around, or animal workers, has been critique of the way that animals are used in work. So I suppose I want to ask, do you think there might be a danger in talking about animals as workers, in that it could serve to whitewash existing exploitative relationships between humans and animals?
It certainly could. And I also differentiate in some of my earlier work between recognizing work and calling animals or someone else a worker. So in my book, Animals, Work, and the Promise of Interspecies Solidarity, I grapple with that question a little bit about the role of words and terms and identities. Yes, there's a risk, rhetorically, of saying, they're workers. We see examples in different kinds of exploitive industries where language of labor is enlisted, but I think that everything needs to be more nuanced, and that we can certainly start by recognizing a broad spectrum of work that animals engage in. So, for example, I argue that we need to recognize wild animals' forms of subsistence work that they do to literally survive, their forms of care work that they engage in to tend to their family members and offspring. I have a broad vocabulary that I develop in my first book and elsewhere on recognizing these other kinds of work, because we do tend to, at least in the global north, to have particular assumptions about work, even when it comes to people. So even our anthropocentric ideas about work tend to be fairly Eurocentric, fairly androcentric, and that particularly, you think work and you're picturing perhaps blue collar factory work or manual work, when the reality for people always has been much more diverse, that people have engaged in a broader set of livelihoods to generate income, to subsist, to reproduce themselves. And that the same is true of different kinds of animals. So I think we start from a broader perspective, which is seeing the full cross section of ways that animals engage in different kinds of work, including in more unexpected ways. So for example, the wild animals. I think that it's valuable to recognize voluntary work that animals may do in our homes, choosing to care for us and comfort us if we're sick or upset. Animals have this extraordinary ability to empathize and to understand and read our emotions. And so we have certainly put that to use in formal workplace settings with service dogs, emotional support animals, therapy animals of different kinds, etc. But I would also argue that animals may choose to do certain kinds of labor in our homes for us, and that's particularly significant when people are homeless or precariously housed. The protective work that dogs, for example, do for women who are trying to survive on the streets is incredibly significant and often life-saving. So yes, the idea of recognizing animals' work could be used to obfuscate problems, but it can also be used to illuminate and to expand our lens and see animals differently, see animals in a more complex and multidimensional way. That's why I think context is always crucially important. We can't make blanket statements like using labor will result in harm to animals or the justification of harm, or using labor will not. Neither of those is accurate. It completely depends, and it's very context specific. And so in the book, there are a number of chapters that look more at broad trends, others which hone in on particular case studies, because it's in many ways the idea of animals and labor is what I would call an invitation to think differently, to think more carefully, to think with more care. And I emphasize in particular, on the topic of care, the prospects for humane jobs for animals to be predominantly in forms of care, where we have already begun to recognize those abilities in animals in a formal sense, as I've mentioned, and that those sorts of sectors which are premised on providing care to others are already underscored by ideas of fairness and equity and compassion. And therefore, they offer a good foundation from which to ethically engage animals. At the same time, in another article, I've examined the conundrum of care and care work a little bit, because of course, for many animals, particularly those in industrial agriculture, not only do we not recognize their forms of care work rhetorically or discursively, we literally prevent them from engaging in their own forms of self-initiated care work. So, the pigs in the gestation crates who who want to be engaging in care work for their piglets are physically unable to do so. They can lie down and stand up, but they can't turn around or move. They cannot comfort or teach their offspring. Veal calves who are removed from their calves who become veal. Let me correct that. Are an example of the repression of care work. So even that idea of care, which we think positive things, we still want to take a context-specific, nuanced approach to it more generally. I think there's potential, but also a need to always be cautious, self-reflexive, and ideally informed by data.
That's fascinating. So that's a kind of clear example of where this story about the kinds of work that animals do that might not be recognized by many of us as work can actually open up conversations about how we're mistreating them.
I think so. And, there's a broad, interdisciplinary feminist literature that I enlist and use and often modify or adapt to think about animal contexts. But I also think that, care work scholars who are focused on humans, that those who are thinking along those kinds of ways, I think there's a lot of potential for symbiosis and productive dialogue, asking people to see animals and their experiences very differently. And that can also be the case for researchers looking at wild animals. I think potentially for those focused on nature or environmental or ecological questions, that if we invite and engage with them on questions of those wild animals are also engaging in forms of work, that there could be some fruitful dialogue there. There's also potential for helping non-scholars think about animals in different ways, right? When people are frustrated because in my province, it's usually raccoons who have, gone through people's garbage and recycling and, made a decorative piece of art on their driveway with orange peels and tea bags. If you recognize, yes, that's a mild inconvenience, but that those raccoons are engaging in subsistence work. They too are trying to survive in our multi-species communities. They were here first. In my view, they are neighbors, and that we are sharing these communities. Of course, I know you have a global audience, and so those kinds of particulars are going to vary depending on where people are located. But if we almost every kind of animal can be looked at through a labor lens. In fact, I would argue that every animal engages in some kind of work. It's just usually not what might first come to mind when you think about work. When you expand your lens and recognize that, even for people, work can be unpaid, it can be voluntary, it can be done in the home, it can be done outside the home, it's some mixture. If you recognize that work is in fact a much more complex tapestry, you can examine animals of all kinds and see the forms of work that they're engaged in of their own choice, forms of work that they might like to engage in, and perhaps we are preventing them from doing it. It's quite a fruitful and stimulating way to think differently and to know animals differently.
Wow. Well, that is exciting. Now, Kendra, everyone who comes on Knowing Animals is asked to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I think so.
So, first of all, can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
It's an interesting question because how do we specifically define scholarship per se? So certainly as a child, I was reading books, or books were being read to me that I know had a significant impact on my thinking. But in terms of formal scholarship, I would argue that it was probably Carol Adams and Josephine Donovan's edited collection, Animals and Women, which I would have picked up as an undergrad, desperate for scholarship on animals that wasn't science. So at the time, I was very motivated by animals and social justice issues. I loved animals. I wanted to study them, but at the time, animal studies as we now know it, thanks to the work of so many dedicated path-making scholars, didn't exist. So if you wanted to study animals at that time, you had to do science. So I understood the value and benefit, I still do, of science, but I wanted to understand animals in different ways. I thought that we could use strategies, methodologies, tools, frameworks from the social sciences and humanities to think and understand them. So I was very excited when I began to learn about this small body of ecofeminist scholarship that had existed, and that book is a really powerful and enduring, still significant collection that I believe was probably the first official piece of animal studies scholarship that I read.
Excellent. And can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
So I had some sense that this question was coming, so I did look it up. And again, I fundamentally believe in the importance of sharing our ideas, not only through scholarly and academic venues and vehicles, but also with a broader audience. So, on my CV, I would say the first pro-animal piece of scholarship was a column I wrote for the Huffington Post, aptly called "Animals Are Workers Too." And it sought to help the public begin to see different kinds of work that animals might be doing, whether it's formal work, where you might say that's an animal worker, or just thinking about the very sorts of things that we've been discussing during this lovely podcast, that work can be understood in a broader set of ways. And if we recognize it, what do we do next? What is owed to animals? What sorts of protections should they have? And I, at the time, argued that they were entitled to both bread and roses. So for non-labor scholars, that's an expression that extends from some garment workers, a lot of immigrant women's strikes in the United States. And they said, yes, we need bread, but we need roses too. And I think that's a really powerful way of thinking about work, which is that, yes, we need the material basics of life, but we and animals are also entitled to beauty, to joy, and to hope.
Fantastic. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you and your work, who would it be?
It's such an unfair question because there are so many interesting people, and I really feel it's my duty, but it's also a pleasure to be reading broadly across the disciplines, across interdisciplinary fields. I will enlist and be inspired by pieces of all sorts of different kinds of scholars' work. If I had to narrow a little bit, I might not say one. I might say Barbara Noska's work was really significant in terms of thinking about the animal industrial complex and certain kinds of animals as examples of alienated labor. I often use, you'll appreciate this as a philosopher, Josh, I quite enjoy Laurie Gruen's work on empathy, on entangled empathy, on empathetic engagement. That has inspired some of my thinking about interspecies solidarity. I would also say Nick Taylor, who's at Canterbury in Australia now, does such an interesting and dynamic cross-section of research, whether it's emotion work in shelters or small c critical animal studies on domestic violence and animals. Given the breadth of topics that I focus on, I find her work really inspiring. And I will actually also take this opportunity to highlight Dr. Margaret Robinson, who's a Mi'kmaq scholar at Dalhousie University in Canada. And she's doing really fascinating research, revisiting some Indigenous mythologies and stories through a multi-species lens and through a vegan framework. And so, I would encourage listeners to check out Margaret Robinson's, really exciting research.
It strikes me that that's an incredibly interdisciplinary group of scholars, which is quite exciting for an animal studies podcast.
And I think we all benefit from reading across and through each other's work. I think that there are so many interesting complementarities and different ways to challenge ourselves and think differently and see new possibilities when we really expand our disciplinary lenses.
What's the most important thing, do you think, that academics can do for animals?
In addition to our research, which I hope will be nuanced and detailed, rigorous, precise, I think it's really crucial to speak to non-academics as well. So given the severity, the depth and the breadth of the problems we're grappling with, and the amount of physical, psychological, emotional, and intergenerational damage that we are doing to animals, we can't remain in our silos. So that extends from the disciplinary dimension, that we need to be reading and thinking in an interdisciplinary way. But I would also argue that whenever possible, we should be thinking about the outcomes of our research. How do we communicate? Who do we work with? Who do we write for? I recognize that scholars are differently positioned in their careers and their institutions, and that that there's a very uneven terrain for academic labor globally. But I would argue that one of the most important things we should be doing whenever we can is thinking about the diversity of ways that we engage with audiences. So those might be stakeholders, they might be policymakers, it might be the general public. And this podcast is obviously an important example of that, which is that we can speak to and with different kinds of audiences so that our important findings and this ethical commitment we have to scholarship, which defends, protects, empowers, and improves the lives of animals, doesn't just remain at universities.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
That we all too often devalue their lives and devalue their experiences. I think if we had greater respect for other species, that would be a powerful engine for helping us address many of the destructive things that we do. So I would see that as a core, or the nucleus from which I hope we could begin to not only think but act much more ethically and much more humanely.
Excellent. So Kendra, would you like to share with listeners what you're working on next?
Oh, well, I have a wonderful grant thanks to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So I'm working with my co-investigator, Dr. Amy Fitzgerald from the University of Windsor, and a team of students looking at animal protection work and policy, and particularly examples of public investment where protecting animals has been seen as a public priority. And so that research is ongoing. I'm also always studying horses and horse well-being from different angles, and increasingly looking at the food production piece of the humane jobs terrain, and what sorts of organizations are transitioning from killing animals to being plant-based. I'm interested in how rural communities and farming communities can actually benefit from what I think will be the decrease, if not the demise, of factory farming as a result of innovations in cultured meat and dairy, a topic I know of, which is of great interest to you as well. I'm particularly interested in the prospects for reviving and diversifying rural communities, for reshaping rural spaces. So there will be fewer but happier animals. There will be care farms. There will be different kinds of food production. And in what sorts of things we can be doing now to better protect animals through public policy. So whether that's in terms of direct animal protection laws and enforcement, the prevention of harm, or through the food angle. So it's sort of this animal protection umbrella, of which there are a few different ongoing projects, all of which are very exciting, very important. It's certainly a very difficult and complicated time. I know all of your listeners are feeling similar and different things about this moment. This has been quite a year. Of course, we began with absolutely brutal forest fires in Australia, in California, in the United States, elsewhere, and obviously things have gotten even more complicated. But I think at the same time we have seen important examples of hope. We have seen the role that animals can play in comforting people become more salient. We have seen more discussion about the risks which are embedded in factory farming. So not only there, of course, fatal effects on animals, but the risks for future pandemics. All of these things are very affecting. But at the same time, we need to maintain our resolve and, be designing research projects and engaging in dialogue that is about strengthening our minds and our ideas, but also really making change and making tangible differences, compelling, significant differences for other animals. And so I do think that there are also reasons for hope as well.
That's an optimistic thought to almost close the podcast. How can people find out more about your work?
I hope they will, and I would love to hear from listeners if they are interested in discussing these things anymore or have ideas. I have a number of websites, so brocu.ca/kcoulter. There's humanejobs.org, animalprotection.ca. I hope that perhaps in the social media for the podcast that you will share my Twitter handle, and that those are all great ways for us to engage, probably virtually for now. But let's work together so we can all have more bread and roses.
Well, thanks very much, Kendra. That's been really enlightening.
It's a pleasure, Josh. Wonderful to speak with you.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. And you can also follow me. I'm on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn and on Instagram at @veganphilosopher. I'm new to both sites, so I'm looking for interesting people to follow. Also, don't forget to tell others about Knowing Animals and to write a review of the podcast on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.